Hello, Guyana, and welcome to Facing the Nation. I am Malika Ramsey. Thank you very much for joining us for another, what promises to be actually another informative week. I trust that all would have been having a pleasant week despite the conditions we're facing in our nation. On today's program, a Partnership for National Unity and, of course, the Brigadier are expressing concerns with the fact that we can't seem to be able to control what's happening in the security sector, and the most important part of that is the fact that if we can control what's happening in the security sector, we'll be able to preserve our nation's greatest resource. And we always tell you, we believe that our nation's greatest resource is definitely our human resource, or I should say our human resources. The Brigadier, that's Brigadier David Granger, leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, is calling on the president to play a greater role, or to play an actual role in terms of solving violent crimes in our country, because that's the only way we're going to be able to preserve our human resources, by solving violent crimes, continued violent crimes. Of course, with me is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika.
All right. Great to have you. Well, of course, our discussion is going to be very, very detailed today, because we're not only focusing on one aspect of crime. Of course, you know, there are various aspects of crime, and this conversation and this discussion comes at an opportune time, because the Guyana Police Force recently revealed statistics regarding our country's performance in the security sector within the past 9 months or so. So today we'll be talking about armed robberies, murder, and suicide. Of course, they often forget that suicide is also a crime. Rape and other interpersonal violence, road deaths. You know, we continue to have a problem with that. And today's feature, the first part of it, focuses on the statistics that came out of the Guyana Police Force regarding road deaths and, of course, road accidents. And, of course, we're also going to be talking about river and piracy deaths. So those are the crimes that we're focusing on today's program. Now, about the clip that we're showing to you. The first part of the clip focuses on a discussion I recently had with the founder of Mothers in Black, or some know it as the Alicia Foundation. That foundation was launched several years ago after Miss Denise Dias, the head of the foundation, lost her daughter through a road accident, horrific road accident, actually. So you'll hear some of her thoughts regarding what we should be doing and what we've missed in terms of stemming and reducing road accidents. So let's take a look at that clip, and we'll come right back and we'll chat with the Brigadier. Just an introduction there to today's program and today's topic. If you're now joining us, we are discussing the importance of keeping our human resources safe and keeping it protected, of course, this week. And I now immediately hand you over to Brigadier David Granger, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika. The simple truth is that Guyana is becoming a very unhappy place because it's a very unsafe place. And we are concerned with the most serious crimes which affect human beings, the crimes which threaten life and, of course, erode human safety. Those are basically armed robbery, because many armed robberies could end up in murder. There are execution murders, particularly I think this week we were greeted with the news of a businessman who was executed in the most gruesome manner. His head was cut off and found some distance away from the body. Then there are suicides, and many of our young Guyanese, and nobody knows exactly how many people commit suicide because the reports might be inaccurate. A former Minister of Health said there were between 108 to 200 suicides every year in Guyana, mostly of young people. And we can't afford to continue losing our human resources at that rate. There are rapes. Some occasions, rapes end up in murders, rape murders, but the brutality of rape is something horrendous, and we've seen pickets. We've seen several non-governmental organizations picketing the Ministry of Health, picketing the police and the Ministry of Home Affairs to demand a change in the attitude of the administration to this horrible crime. Then we have road deaths, and there are certain areas of this country which have had a high death toll. And I am calling on the Guyana Police Force to monitor those areas to ensure that there is no speeding or drinking or driving under the influence of alcohol. And those areas are well known. Many accidents have taken place on what I call Death Alley between Houston and Eccles. It's a very congested area, and people fly through that area. And there are a lot of villages. Most of the roads in Guyana are really public roads running through villages. They're not highways. And because they're village roads, you see people drying rice, you see vendors, you see animals, sometimes builders' waste, people liming at the corner. And that contributes to not only congestion, but sometimes it contributes to accidents as well. So we know pretty well which areas are most susceptible to fatal traffic accidents, because that is where some of the vehicles, minibuses and other vehicles, speed by day and by night. And of course the river deaths. And this is really sad, because if the Guyana police force, in fact the commissioner of police went up to quarantine a few weeks ago, and most of what he heard, he really got an earful. Most of what he was told were complaints from ordinary fishermen. These are poor people, these are not magnates, these are poor people who go out to fish in order to earn their living. And if they don't fish, they don't earn a living. So when somebody robs them, takes away their engine, takes away their seine and whatever they caught, they are really left destitute until they can get a replacement. And of course, that equipment is very, very expensive. But many of them, I can't say how many, at least for this year, at least a dozen, at least more than one a month, would have been killed on the seas, and some of them disappeared. We don't know what happened to them until the bodies wash up on the shore. It's most gruesome. Can you think of a wife waiting for her husband night after night, and then discover that there's a body on the foreshore? Next morning she goes and discovers it's her husband, and bloated and maybe bits eaten off by the fish. It's terrible. And then of course we have other forms of interpersonal violence. Sometimes friends go to a wedding and they become so drunk they start to fight each other, and it ends up in death. There are a lot of murders which can be described as disorderly murders. And it points to the fact that perhaps alcohol consumption among young people is a contributory factor to some of these crimes. So we are concerned in Partnership for National Unity. We are concerned most of all about human safety, about the protection of human lives. And right now, the government is making a mess of it, because after 22 years, we don't see any improvement. In fact, the statistics show, the data shows that the trends continue to rise, that there are more deaths taking place, even though there is not a state of emergency in the country.
Brigadier, thank you very much. A lot said indeed, a lot we can digest. But before we talk specifically about government and state policy and what more they can do, why do you believe that the society, our citizens, seem to have lost almost all respect for the Guyana Police Force and the work that they should be doing? And I'm asking this, you're going to use an example that you yourself used. This week we read about the discovery of a headless body, or the discovery of the head of an individual in a plastic bag. You have to be fearless of the law if you're going to commit such a crime and just live after that. Your thoughts?
Well, this is a result of the government's policy. Let us look at one policy, what is called the counter-narcotics policy. There ought to be a document called the National Drug Strategy Master Plan. In fact, the government itself, this PPP administration, has introduced two separate National Drug Strategy Master Plans. Neither of the two was ever implemented. The last one expired 5 years ago, in 2009. It simply has not been replaced. The public could come to the conclusion that the government simply doesn't care. If you know that narco-trafficking is a problem, narco-trafficking pumps guns and violence into the country. It is the main factor that contributes to execution murders. What we saw with the beheading of a businessman typifies narco-terrorism. That is, it's not an ordinary murder, it's not domestic, husband and wife. It is probably done by persons who are in the narco-trafficking business. The fact is that there's no national drug strategy master plan. And as long as there's no plan, well, there's no way of utilizing your resources in order to overcome the problem. So what I see happening there is that the absence of a plan is a contributory factor to gun running and narco trafficking, which are two of the important crimes which create violence in our country.
Why is government not, or I should ask you, why does it seem as though they're not interested in a drug strategy master plan, a national drug strategy master plan?
You'll have to ask Clement Roy next time you see him, because it is quite clear that the absence of that plan is a contributory factor. And you would have thought that any government which shared a responsibility to protect what they call R2P in the new computer language, the responsibility to protect, would be concerned about creating a strategy or having a plan to protect citizens. But if there's no plan, there's no protection. And that is what we see happening. So we know that drugs are coming into the country, but we don't discover that until people attempt to take the drugs out. That is to say, in famous pink suitcase, or a few grams in a brassiere, or as has happened this year, in timber or in coconut milk by the container load. So the government has got to have a good idea of what is happening, because it has not provided the resources that could protect our citizens or prevent drugs from coming into the country. Guyana is a big country by Caribbean standards, or even in comparison with its population. That is, the population density is about 3.5 per square kilometer. This means that there are huge open areas and roadways which people can just land and take off. And unless you equip an organization like the Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit, CANU, or the Police Anti-Narcotics Unit, unless you give them all-terrain vehicles, unless you give them aircraft, they won't be able to protect the country from drug trafficking.
If I can switch to another crime for a bit, interpersonal violence, which you yourself touched on earlier. Government and any ordinary citizen may say to you that, look, sir, there is nothing that a government can necessarily do to stop interpersonal violence, because, for example, you talked about what may happen in a rum shop after someone has finished imbibing. In domestic case, if people don't report domestic violence, we can't know what's going on in a household. People may say, look, we can't do anything to stop interpersonal violence.
We could do a lot. In the education system, there needs to be the sort of inculcation of values. Going to school is not just about, geometry and arithmetic. It is about values. People learn to share, they learn to develop mature relationships. They learn to respect each other and each other's property. And things like that would help to build or to create a citizen who is less likely to fight for something he wants, and maybe to seek a non-conflictual way of getting it. If you want borrow somebody's pen or ruler, you don't just take it. You ask, but things like that. It might sound small, but the education system has to create values of respect for each other. So that is where the problem started, the education system. But in the community itself, and in the household, of course, because the family is the place where these values should be taught and should be practiced. A mother or a father should, among the children, should insist that people speak to each other, children speak to each other in a respectful manner. But going beyond the family into the community, we know that there are vulnerable citizens. They might be very young or very old. They might be shut-ins because they suffer from some physical disability. And we have found cases in Guyana in which vulnerable persons have been robbed and raped, and because they've been isolated. But if there's a good system of community policing, a neighborhood police, you should be able to detect which citizens are vulnerable, and maybe even if there is, over a period of days or weeks or months, you hear loud shouting, you know that the husband and wife are fighting, and he's threatened to kill, the wife is threatened to kill the husband, or the husband is threatened to kill the wife. That is an opportunity for an intervention by the law enforcement agency. So what you need is a different type of policing. Perhaps you need more female police officers who could counsel women when they are in difficulty. Because sometimes a woman who is a victim of domestic violence is uncomfortable speaking with a male police sergeant, yes, in a very perfunctory manner, but a female could maybe visit her home, find out what the problem is, and in circumstances where life has been threatened, maybe there could be some intervention by a religious organization or by a state organization. So we're looking at it at the level of the school, in which values are taught, respectful values, and I think most Guyanese are now aware of some situations involving school children, school girls and school boys. But what I'm saying is that it's respect which must be taught, values and standards. Then there's a situation in the home itself, among parents and between parents and children, and a situation in the community. That all policing does not have to be, arrest and imprisonment. Some policing could be, problem solving, conflict resolution. And sometimes maybe a senior police officer might visit a couple which maybe because they have some difficulties or they've been quarreling for a long time, and try to resolve those difficulties. So we're looking at real community policing. We're not looking at people in black t-shirts walking around with batons and handcuffs trying to arrest somebody. We're looking at a system which keeps communities safe. So I would say that we can do a lot to protect women and children and vulnerable citizens. We can do a lot to reduce the level of interpersonal violence.
Sir, I'm happy that you talked about you touched on it, the community policing groups, and you talked about the fact that we need to detect vulnerable persons. All of that is a way of reducing interpersonal violence. Is it fair to say that the current system of community policing that we have, that those persons in that group, or those groups I should say, are not properly trained?
Well, they're trained for improper purposes. I mean, it may add up to the same thing. Community policing ought to be a system which allows residents of a community to engage with the regular police force in order to ensure that the community is made a safer place. Guyana has a variant which is really an aberration. I don't know any other country in the world that practices Guyana's system. What Guyana has here is vigilantes. People with, they're given some form of uniform, they're given handcuffs and equipment, and they go out and do, but that is not community policing. It's the police who have the power to do that sort of community work. But the citizens help the police. But there must be an interaction, an engagement between the citizens and the police. But you don't need to train a vigilante squad. Similarly, neighborhood policing. These are people who would go, look, we had a situation in Wakanam and in Moka a few years ago, and also in Parika, Namrik, I think, where you have very young girls. These are girls who were barely 10, school girls, sometimes on their way to school, who were raped and murdered. But because they had to pass maybe through some part of the village or the community, which was desolate, and youngsters who were dropouts from school, sat down there day after day, they seeing this girl, and And one day they just grabbed her, well, not one, it's happened on several occasions. They just grabbed her, raped her, and killed her, What I'm saying is that we could do better by having a system of community policing which helps to identify threats and would help the police to respond to those threats. In those communities, there are questions of maybe street lighting. At certain times of the year, it becomes dark quite early. Children going to lessons, they're taking National Grade 6 next year, and they're coming home from classes, and it's quite dark. And sometimes you may have layabouts in the village, you may have unemployed boys who, as they say in Guyana, interfere with the girls, and it could create a problem. So when you have a community in which there are no street lights, no pavements, no big duty policemen, the policemen are just in the station, they don't move out. Sometimes you go into some communities and there are no policemen around. So you don't generate that feeling of confidence or security. And when you go to the police station, there's just one person on duty. You call up, there's an incident, oh, we can't come, we don't have a bicycle, we don't have a motor car, or I can't leave the station. The police force, by my calculation, I'm not sure if it's up to date, but it used to be like 20% on the strength. So one of the duties of the state is to bring the police force up to strength. So you can have policemen in the station and policemen walking around the community, visiting schools, visiting, homes, visiting entertainment spots, reassuring the community that the law is there to ensure that breaches do not occur. But that doesn't happen. In many communities, the police station, policemen, and that's all, even sometimes in the hinterland. If you do not have enough policemen, they cannot go on patrol into the various indigenous communities, in villages, into mining camps, into logging camps, and they just stay there and wait for reports to come in. Next thing you know, 2 miners were drinking and somebody pulled a gun and shot. Or in Mali, a woman gets raped. But in those communities, the police are so few that criminals could reasonably assume that they could literally get away with murder. It's just weak policing system.
Brigadier.
And the further you away from Georgetown you get, the weaker it becomes.
2 things coming out of what you said. The first one I want to focus on basically is saying that then it's a domino effect, because if you're not paying the police officers properly, if they're not properly remunerated, they wouldn't want to take up those extra duties. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, it is true, because the Discipline Forces Commission, 10 years ago, I had the honor to serve on that commission, but I do feel that the report of that commission has not been properly dealt with. And we have to solve the problem. No matter how much you talk about new police stations or motorbikes, in the final analysis, that policeman, that constable, that lance corporal has to put food on his wife's table, has to feed his children. And it is unsatisfactory, the way or the level at which policemen are paid. And sending them to the hinterland with those same salaries creates bigger problems, because the policeman now has to keep his home wherever he's living, on the coastland, wife and children, maybe pay rent and so on, and keep himself in the hinterland. Now, when you go to the hinterland, you discover that most of the things that a policeman would need on a day-to-day basis, for example, food, stuff to wash his clothes and so on, are very expensive, because most things go into the hinterland by road, by freight, by aircraft. And as a result of that, they're very expensive. For example, at Cameron, gasoline is sold $2,800 a gallon. You couldn't drive your car with that high-cost gasoline. More than double the price on the coast, nearly 3 times the price in some places, I suppose. So we have a very serious problem if you do not pay police properly. In addition to that, if you don't train them properly. And many of the new crime, but I can't call it new crime, they're old crimes, but in a policeman's mind, if he's not properly trained, he regards that as minor, as a domestic. You know, a man may kill his wife, you know, but that's like domestic crime. So when a wife complains, my husband's threatened to kill me, oh yeah, I'll go and make it up. But we need to have a different type of training. The policeman tends to be trained. I'm not trying to create a stereotype here. The policeman tends to be trained to arrest wrongdoers, putting them before the courts. Some crimes, you know, some crimes have to be solved, or some situations have to be resolved in a non-conflictual manner. In other words, if there's a problem between husband and wife, maybe they need to be spoken to, they need to be visited, you know. The wife, if she's the victim, or the husband, if she's the victim, if he's the victim, need to be given some assurance of protection. So you need a different type of police training, not somebody to go there and arrest, but somebody to solve, to discuss and solve problems. And also you need to give the police correct equipment. Now, some of the areas which police have to patrol are quite large, and it may be best to give a policeman a horse, or a motorbike, or a bicycle. But when you go to the police station, if these means of transportation are not available, the policeman doesn't go, because the distance is too great. So the Ministry of Home Affairs or the government of Guyana have to start thinking outside of the circle, so to speak. You know, they have to start thinking about, well, how can the policeman get to the scene? Should we give him a bicycle? Why not give him a bicycle? He's not going to walk. He's not going to take a hire car. There's no police car there. So we have to start thinking about that, solving problems. The policemen don't have proper salaries, they're not properly trained, they don't have the equipment. How are they going to do the jobs? So I don't like to blame the police, because I know a lot of hardworking policemen and women. I know that most of the people who enter the force want to do a good job. They want to solve crimes, you know, but they are not given the resources. They're not paid properly, they're not trained properly, and they don't have the equipment they need to do their work, especially in some out-of-town areas.
Okay. Brigadier, I want to stay on that note of out-of-town and hinterland communities for a bit longer. But before I do that, viewers, if you're now tuning in, of course, this is Facing the Nation. And today we're talking about the importance of human safety and the fact that the security sector has been failing our human resources. I may not be able to take your calls today, of course, because we need to get a lot, and this discussion is also coming at a time when the Guyana Police Force would have recently revealed some of the crime statistics thus far for 2014. Brigadier, we've seen two major projects in Region 4. The All Boys Tongue Impact Project, and then there was one created in Tiger Bay. I don't know how successful that one would have been. Why have we not seen this same sort of energy, mobilization, and resources taken to the hinterland communities? This is apart from all that you've said about what's needed for the hinterland communities. Why weren't these projects first introduced in those faraway communities?
Because the projects are conceptualized, they have been conceptualized as cosmetic projects. They're not serious projects. They stigmatize or they profile certain communities which are depressed. There might be high levels of unemployment. But the most serious crimes in the country are not necessarily committed in these communities. The most serious crimes, for example, might very well be execution murders or murders, might be drug trafficking, might be piracy. Well, there's no piracy in Tiger Bay. It might be a bay, but there's no piracy there. So the police force finds it easy, or the leadership of the police force finds it easy to pick the punks on these communities. If you go in Tiger Bay, you'll see the remnants of old police programs. They've been going there for years, for decades. But they are not geared to solve the national crime problem. If you want to solve crime, you have to look at the causes of crime and not necessarily the manifestations. it is not a fact that poor people are necessarily criminal people, but you can catch the headlines. Commander A visits community B and hands out some computer or footballs or something. But that doesn't necessarily solve the crime. What is the cause of crime? The cause of crime might very well be drug trafficking. So no matter what how many footballs you give out, the drugs will keep coming in, the guns will keep coming in. And that has nothing to do with footballs. So the police force has adopted these programs, and from time to time you'll see photographs in the newspapers, but they do not go to the heart of the problem in this country. And the government has to change its stance and stop. The police force must stop fooling the people, thinking that crime will be solved by these means. The crime is not going to be solved. Crime will be solved when we stop bringing cocaine in the country, when we stop bringing guns in the country, when we cut down contraband. Those are the big crimes that really pump a lot of violence into the country. And we're talking today about violent crime. We're not talking about stealing hubcaps, and bicycles. We're talking about murder. We're talking about rape. We're talking about executions. We're talking about suicide. We're talking about piracy. And look at piracy, for example. Poor fishermen trying to make a living by night, going out there and being robbed, sometimes killed, just thrown overboard like a bag of garbage. And, sometimes a week or two later, then the bodies wash up. You don't hear the Minister of Home Affairs saying anything about these bodies being washed up. You hear Surinamese military and security officials complaining that Guyana is not doing enough to stop piracy. So it's a very serious problem there, and it is a travesty. It's a shame for the police force or the senior echelons of the police force to create the illusion that they're soon doing something about crime when they know very well that they're not solving crime. The big crimes are piracy, the big crimes are banditry, the big crimes are narco-trafficking and gun running. And those things, even though they may feel that they have some social problems in Tiger Bay, yeah, I agree with them, solve the social problems as far as you could. But those are not the main areas that are, pushing crime, serious crime, fatal crime, lethal crime in this country.
I'd like you to turn your attention to and to shed some light on the issue of suicide. As I said earlier, sometimes we forget that suicide is also a crime. My question, sir, is why, when the Guyana Police Force releases these statistics, these crime statistics, and whether it be on a quarterly basis or annual basis or whatever, why don't we hear anything from the force, apart from hearing about suicide on World Suicide Day? Why don't we hear anything from the Guyana Police Force about the statistic, the numbers regarding persons who would have either committed suicide successfully or attempted it over the annual period, the year period?
Well, for one, I think the press corps must do more. The press corps must demand information. And it's a shame that sometimes an ordinary reporter, if he or she wants to do a story on suicide, literally has to go through the newspapers to pick up a news item. Of course, because of the stigma, because of embarrassment, a death may not be published as a suicide, the police may not even record it as a suicide. For example, as you pointed out in the clip, sometimes accidents are not even recorded because unless the victim of an accident goes to maybe a state medical institution and says, well, how did you, and when asked, how did you get that injury, say, I was hit down by a car on the Ruby Public Road, it would not become thing. But if you were hit down by a car, maybe on your way to home in Betterfor Acting Village or Cummings Lodge, and you don't report it, well, it isn't listed as a road accident. So the point I'm making is that the police force are delinquent in their reporting because they do not have an advanced system of ensuring that all of these reports about suicide are are properly reported by medical practitioners who have to examine the bodies, and that a database is created. And one of the ministers of health a few years ago, Dr. Leslie Ramsey, actually said the annual suicide toll would be between 180 to 200 persons. And many of them might not very well be reported because of failure of the families to report or failure of the police to record that death, to investigate or to ensure that the investigation into that death, if there's an autopsy, indicates clearly that it was a suicide. So we cannot solve the problems if we don't know the size of the problem or the nature of the problem. So it's not just a trick. It's not being clever by the police, to show that, serious crimes are done by not reporting serious crimes. They just pick out a few, which they know they can't hide, like murders and traffic accidents. But you don't hear much about rape. You don't hear much about suicides. And sometimes you don't even hear about piracy attacks. It's only when some investigative reporters gets word that a body is washed up at Kildonan foreshore and say, there's one here. But things may be much worse than we actually know.
Before I have to come back to, I want to talk about the economic damage crime has done, and then of course back to policy, government policy. You touched on rape. Do you find that the Guyana Police Force, again, has no idea how to deal with matters of rape? And I'm raising this issue because we would not hear about a rape or rapes as often as we would hear about an armed robbery or a road deaths. But recently, a woman in the hinterland, one of our hinterland communities, she was raped and brutally raped and murdered. And the citizens, the residents there felt that the Guyana Police Force had not done enough to investigate that matter. Do you feel because it's not for want of a better word, popular crime, the police force doesn't really have an idea how to investigate that?
Well, I don't know. I know it's a notorious crime, but you have several problems. There is a historical problem because the police force is largely male. It's largely male. I don't know the percentage, but it may be as much as 85% male to 15% female. Male policemen, because of their own upbringing and because of their own education, their own training, may not pay as much attention, they may not be as sensitive to the crime of rape as a female. And some policemen could make very stupid statements about rape. She's begging for trouble, look how she's dressed, that is no excuse. How a woman carries herself, she smokes, she drinks, she parties, so what? That is not an excuse for rape. So many policemen have to be given the type of training which encourages them to think more sympathetically about persons who report rape, about investigating charges, not brushing it off as some domestic, because they could be rape within a household, And I think that one of the problems is that many policemen are simply not trained to treat rape as a serious crime. They just maybe say, some relationship gone sour. It's not a relationship gone sour, it's a crime. The second thing is that we really need to have more female police officers who can deal with these cases sympathetically. I'm just hoping that in cases where there is a sufficient number of female policewomen at the station, a victim could go to that person and expect to be listened to, not to be treated as if she's reporting a missing bicycle or a parrot was stolen or a parrot cage. But somebody listens sympathetically and don't start laughing at her, go home and kiss the man and make up or something like that, So it is a question of training, it is a question of staffing, but it's also a question of fact of recognizing that there is legislation, there is a Sexual Offences Act, and persons who are found to be in breach of that act must be prosecuted according to the law. And it means that if a senior officer discovers that the reports are being swept under the carpet or having been reported, they're not being followed up. No arrests are being made, no investigation conducted. That type of policing that bad policing is corrected so that there could be more effective investigation of these crimes. And they tend to take place in rural and hinterland areas. I don't have the statistics, but my own reading of the newspaper reports suggests that rural and isolated areas have a higher rate of rapes and rape murders because of the inefficiency or the inadequacy of police equipment. They just can't get to the scene, and there have been some horrific rape murders. Maybe a woman who works in a bar, she might have been drinking, so what? They discover her body, 6 o'clock in the morning by some gutter or by the trench, and they knew that she was drinking with several men at a table, but somehow or the other, it becomes a cold case. 3 years pass, and everybody knows the waitress was brutally murdered, but there's no murder charge. So the question of rape is a very serious one. It calls for retraining police. It calls for providing police with equipment such as testing kits for DNA, so that when a woman complains, there is a medical practitioner attached to that police division or the station who could conduct tests and verify that a woman. But rape now includes pedophilia. It may be young boys who've been raped by older men. So it's not just boy girl or man woman. It could be man boy or something like that. So we need to have policemen trained in a variety of these sexual offenses, which could be described as rape. But also, and again, I don't want to make extravagant claims here, but there is a crime of statutory rape, and there is a problem in our school system in which there have been reported incidents. You can get the statistics from the Ministry of Education of teachers having illicit relations with students. Once the student is under the age of consent, that could classify as statutory rape. And sometimes as we have read recently in the newspaper, a 12-year-old girl from a particular region goes into the hospital to deliver a child. It means she has been raped. And there's no way under the law that a 12-year-old girl could consent to sexual relations. She hasn't reached the age of consent. So we need to have a revisit, a relook, a review of the policing measures to deal with both with statutory rape and of course the more serious rapes, which sometimes end up in murder. And the police force has to take the lead in that, but the state itself too has to ensure that the policy is directed to protecting citizens. And I believe if you had a policing policy which was committed to protecting people rather than simply making arrests, we would see a change.
Brigadier, as we have to wrap up, you just said it, the state needs to play a greater role, but I'm going to quote exactly from a press statement released by your partnership this week. Well, today rather. The president must step forward to stop the surge in violent crime. In the minute or so that we have left of today's broadcast, exactly what it is that you want Mr. Donald Ramatara to do at this point in time to protect our human resources.
Well, after 22 years of PPP administration, and we've seen the crime situation getting worse, we know that crime will not solve itself. It needs intervention, and that intervention has to come from the state. What I want Mr. Ramatara to do is to investigate serious crime. I want him to ensure and implement measures to deal with the causes of crime. We mustn't only tackle crime by arresting more people. The jails are full already. We want to deal with the causes of crime. And I'm sure when we take that approach, we will start to protect our borders, prevent guns from coming into the country. We'll start to look after our vulnerable citizens, and we'll make sure that criminals who commit these horrific offenses are put behind bars.
In other words, prevention is better than cure.
Correct.
Thank you very much, sir. Of course, with me was leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. Viewers, our time today has come and gone. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to take your calls. Of course, you know, human safety is a very, very important topic. The Brigadier and the Partnership for National Unity are very, very passionate about protecting our citizens. I am Malika Ramsey. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Be good Guyanese citizens. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And since this is the last program that we'll be having before Diwali, I think I should give the Brigadier just about 30 seconds to give you some Diwali greetings, sir.
Well, Diwali is the festival of lights. It's one of the happiest festivals in Guyana. It is a Hindu festival, but I think it is true to say that all Guyanese enjoy Diwali. Happy Diwali to Guyana.
Thank you very much, sir, and I wish you all the same. Be good Guyanese citizens, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, join me again next week. Goodbye.